It is the 1st of November, which means that we have left October and Halloween safely behind us. We've made it into the darker months of the year. With the end of the month comes a chance to round up what we've read, or at least what I've read, although I'd always love to hear what you've read as well. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. October also marks the start of the academic year here in Germany. We start a little later than most, but we also keep going a little longer in our winter semester. So I spend a lot of October reading and preparing for my module that I'm teaching now. So I did a lot of interesting reading for that, but all of that was academic mostly, or medieval. So you'll see some of that reading pop up in our Let's Get Medieval episodes, but they didn't necessarily contribute to me also getting some fiction reading done. However, kind of looking back on it, I still managed to finish 5 books this month, so somehow the reading always finds a space. The first book I finished in October, although I started reading it at the beginning of September, I really took my time with it, is City of Bones by Martha Wells. Now, I'd never heard of Martha Wells before, which kind of feels like a crime now that I've finished one of her books. She's been writing since the early or mid-90s and has created all kinds of fascinating fantasy and science fiction worlds. So I was really glad to discover Martha Wells for myself, thanks to Tordotcom, a publisher re-releasing some of her works in new kind of versions. So City of Bones, the version I read, is kind of specifically marketed as an updated and revised edition, which Martha Wells herself prefers. So City of Bones is about a city called Charizard, I think, or Charizard, maybe. And it was built by the ancients, and it sits on the edge of the Waste, which is this massive desert, because the world in which City of Bones takes place has been hit by something that is at once kind of extreme climate change, but maybe also just damnation and punishment. It's not entirely sure what has happened, but the Waste, this massive desert, has just been spreading. And there's a few kind of remains of civilization who are kind of clinging on to what the ancients may have left them. And there is also in this desert a kind of humanoid race which was created by the ancients in order to survive this changing climate. One of these, they're called Chris or Chrismen, is Kat, and he is our main character, really. And he lives in Charizard and he kind of trades or deals in relics from the ancients' time. He gets drawn into a sort of court intrigue when he is commissioned by a very powerful warder to find new relics for them. And he does this together with a warder apprentice called Ellen, and she is an apprentice. She's still kind of learning all these skills, and the warders have some access to magic, but they're very scared because the magic can drive them mad. So she's kind of on the edge between, I have some powers, but I'm scared to use them, and I want to make sure that my position with the warders is solid, but I'm also really interested in the rest of the world and how the rest of the city lives, because she's used to this elite lifestyle. So Kat and Ellen together become embroiled in this intrigue between the different factions within the city, and they have to, on the one hand, figure out what happened, what caused the waste, why the warders are so interested, what the ruler of the city might potentially have to do with it, if it can be reversed or if it's only going to get worse. And this is not, I will admit, a great summary of the book, but what I can say is that Kat and Ellen are fascinating protagonists. We kind of get to see the story through both of their perspectives. So while Kat really is, I would say, the protagonist, we also get some of the events told to us through Ellen's perspective. And I really like this mix between the two of them because it gives us two different, perspectives of what's happening, and they complement each other very well. And their dual perspectives also really contributes to the world building. And that is what just blew me away about City of Bones, and is also part of the reason why I really took my time with it, because I wanted to dwell in this world just a little bit longer. Just every detail about the plot which Martha Wells adds is relevant, is interesting, comes back up later, or just helps build up this world. I could really picture the city. I could picture the relics that they were talking about. And especially towards the end of the book, when the plot kind of picks up in pace a little bit, that grounding in the world building, which she'd given us at the beginning, just really paid off, because I could follow her and the characters wherever they were going. I knew what was happening, and I had a good understanding of why certain things were happening as well. So, in short, City of Bones is a brilliant fantasy book. It's a standalone, which I also really appreciate. Even though I would love to see more of this world, I really appreciate the fact that sometimes authors just have a story to tell and then do not drag it out. I would maybe love to know where else she could take this world. I think she might have used the same world in some other books, so I'm definitely going to look those up. But it's also nice to have a story that starts, takes place, and then finishes, rather than being dragged out forever. So I would really recommend City of Bones to any readers who enjoy fantasy, but also something that is slightly dystopian and perhaps fantastical and almost maybe a little supernatural. It is not a new book, but I only discovered it now, so if you've also never heard of Martha Wells, look her up. After diving into a fantasy world, I wanted to kind of have a palate cleanser, because I knew which other books I wanted to read, and they were a little bit more speculative, horror, paranormal focused, so I needed a bit of a palate cleanser, like I said, and I decided to dive into a 2016 thriller, which I'd still not read, but was on my list, and that is Lie With Me by Sabine Durrant. In this novel, which I very much enjoyed, we meet an author named Paul Morris. He is the worst. I'll just tell you that now. I started disliking him from probably page 2. I was like, I don't like being in your head. You sound like a horrible human being. So the character of Paul Morris, I think, kind of really responds to this stereotype that maybe we've seen a little bit more often in crime or suspense fiction, which is a male author who has a breakthrough novel that is really lauded by society early on in his life, and who then never has a follow-up, really, who never quite reaches that promise, and who tries to cling on to this idea of himself as a fresh, innovative voice that's worth something, but deep inside he's kind of quite lost. And that is at least a character I've seen in a few other books as well, and they always make me roll my eyes a little bit, because I'm like, stop clinging on, write something or do something else. Paul Morris in Lie With Me is just the perfect amalgamation of this character. He knows he hasn't written anything good in ages. He's just trying to keep up a facade. He's been using people whenever he can. He doesn't have any real relationships because he's always out for himself, always looking how he can kind of maintain his image of the intelligent, intellectual author. He's also obsessed kind of with, I think, sexual conquests, of making women fall in love with him, but he never really connects to it. And well, that is very important for the rest of the plot, because we get a short flash forward at the beginning of Paul Morris in a tricky, difficult situation, which I don't necessarily want to spoil. And the question is basically, how did he end up there? And then we move back to the start of the plot. Paul Morris is about to lose his apartment where he's been living rent-free. He has to move back in with his mother. He hates it. And then through a university friend, he gets reconnected with a woman he met years ago. He doesn't remember meeting her because he was drinking too much at the time, so he has no recollection of her, but they are somehow connected, and he realizes, if I seduce her, I could move in with her, and then I don't have to live with my mother, which is just the worst of motivations. He also wants to get invited to her summer holiday because she has a house in Greece where she and the college friend through which he met her kind of stay every summer, and he wants to get invited because he believes it will be a great chance for him to get out of the country, basically, and have a nice summer holiday. It turns out, however, that all those years back, they also met in Greece, and that a young woman died during that summer. And the woman that he's now kind of dating, who's called Alice, she has been trying to solve this murder. This disappearance, so they don't even know if she's actually dead. And he kind of gets drawn into that investigation. When they're in Greece during the summer, all kinds of things start happening. I loved how twisty Durrant set up this plot, because you do not like the main character, so you're already suspecting him. And the kind of twists and turns, even though I saw many of them coming, I still kind of loved what happened to this dude, which maybe doesn't make me a great person in this particular case. But the other thing I liked about this book is that quite early on we get a reference to someone reading Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. And I was like, that's an interesting hint to put in there. And then I started realizing that not the plot necessarily of Lie With Me, but the intent, the kind of messaging, the way Durrant uses writing and her protagonist is very reminiscent of Lolita. Because as I've mentioned in some other episodes, in Lolita, Nabokov is very much warning against the power of language, the power of point of view. Who is telling you this story? What are their motivations? Do they really understand themselves? Do they understand the impact they have on others? Because you dislike Paul Morris so much, you see the worst of him, but you also start to recognize how he's maybe twisting events for his own gain in his narration to you. That he is telling you about what has happened, but that you can't trust him, that he's an unreliable narrator. But Sabine Durrant plays with that towards the end of the book as well, as kind of it hits the climax of the plot. And I just found that a super interesting way of engaging with Lolita, while also just writing an interesting, fun summer thriller. Don't know if you now have any idea what this book is about, but I would say that I would recommend it. It doesn't take a long time, it's very readable, it's nice and twisty, but it will also give you something to think about. About halfway through October, I also went for a long weekend trip to Oslo in Norway, and I took a short story collection with me called Nordic Visions, the Best of Nordic Speculative Fiction, which is edited by Magrét Helgadóttir and was published by Rebellion. This short story collection features 16 stories from contemporary speculative fiction authors from Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. So it casts a very wide Nordic net. Also, speculative fiction is one of my favorite kind of umbrella genres because it contains so much that I love, from the fantastical to science fiction, dystopian, paranormal, and also kind of abstract or meta writing. Just any kind of story that makes you speculate. It's a great genre title in that sense. It is true for most short story collections, including Nordic Visions, that not every single story will hit you in the same way. Some stories will really make you think, while others will mainly make you go, that was fine, that was interesting, I wonder what's next. There were a few absolute standout stories in this collection for me though. One is The Abyss, which is the one story from the Faroe Islands by Raquel Helmsdal, translated by Marita Thompson. I love this story, even though I wasn't entirely sure what was going on. As the title suggests, there is an abyss and someone is hanging over it and has been hanging over it for as long as they can remember. They tried climbing away from it, but that never seems to do anything. They're just hanging there and wondering if maybe they should let go. There's no real context for this story. It's quite abstract. I think it could maybe be an analogy for depression, or maybe an analogy for how confusing life can be. But it really sort of got my mind started. I was really sort of intrigued by the imagery and by what Helmsdal was trying to do there. Another story which I really liked is the last story, called The Wings That Slice the Sky by Emmi Itäranta from Finland. She also translated it herself from the Finnish to English. And it's kind of like a take on the Finnish Kalevala, which is this collection of mythological, legendary folk material in Finland. There's some debate about how old the Kalevala really is, how authentic, but it's a great sort of legendary cycle of tales set around a couple of heroes. But what Itäranta does in this story is kind of tell the story from the perspective of the main antagonist. It's a story full of love, of fury, wondering where her place is, if she is a monster or just a woman doing her best. It was stunning. I really enjoyed it. Another story I really liked also came from Finland and is A Bird Does Not Sing Because It Has Answers by Johanna Sinisalo. which is kind of dystopian in the sense that it is set in a world where there are very strong protections around the natural environment, around animals. And the story really questions kind of what our human place is. And that made me just really think about climate change, about our place in the world, how much we can protect and how much we should just let nature do its own thing as well. Overall, I just really enjoyed this collection. I was really glad to see a lot of these authors kind of get translated into English, because although I'm learning Norwegian, I don't know if my Norwegian is good enough yet to dive into proper fiction. I've already been warned by my Norwegian teacher about maybe not giving the new Nobel Literature Prize winner a go, because it's quite complex Norwegian which he writes. So I'm glad that some of these authors are finally getting translated into English and that their work is becoming a bit more available. So I would absolutely recommend this collection. After my visit to the Speculative, I decided to dive straight into a horror short story collection, which was Blood from the Air by Gemma Files. I do love me some horror, especially this time of the year, although currently the sun is shining in and it's incredibly warm. But I hadn't ever read anything by Gemma Files, even though I think I'd seen her name around a few times. So I figured, why not get into it in October? There's a couple of stories that really worked for me. One was the second story of the collection, The Harrow, which kind of brought together the idea of anthropology and archaeology and about digging for something, finding further meaning. And then also I've always had this creeping feeling that it would be incredibly nice to dig a nice deep hole and then just lie in there and kind of surrounded by the warm, slightly wet earth and just one with the world. And this story it really scratched that itch for me. Another story that just kind of blew me away was Caligarism, which was really a standout for me because I really enjoyed the film that it's about, which is Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari, which is a German horror film from the Weimar Republic era, so between World War I and World War II. This film was kind of really paradigm shifting for the horror genre. It really revealed kind of new things that film could do. But Files takes it in a completely sort of unexpected direction, which I don't want to spoil at all. But it's all about perspective, what is real, what isn't, what am I witnessing, who am I? And just the way she does it is fascinating. The final story of the collection as well, Koffel, it really had me on the edge of my seat, even if at the beginning I wasn't quite sure where it was going. But somehow what it kept bringing back to my mind was Mad Max Fury Road, which is a film I loved. But maybe that gives you a bit of an idea. There is a desert, there is a struggle for survival, there are potentially gender issues at play, there is conflict. It was a really interesting story. The idea of kind of religion and spiritualism, those themes are quite heavy throughout the entire collection. They either kind of form the core of many of the stories. For example, if it's about angels, there's a real questioning of what is faith, what is religion, when do you go too far? Is the divine what we imagine it to be, or is it so much worse? That isn't necessarily for everyone, which is why I wanted to mention it. That is quite heavy throughout the entire collection. And I really was intrigued by it, but also because I do like thinking about religion in general. So it kind of worked for me in that sense, but it doesn't necessarily do that for everyone. And then finally, the last thing I read was a novella called A Season of Monstrous Conceptions by Lina Rather. This novella is about Sarah, who's training to be a midwife in London at the end of the 17th century, if I remember correctly, just after the Great Fire of London. And she kind of has something bad in her past, which she is running away from, but also doesn't entirely understand. But the main issue is that there's children who are being born who are, as the novella calls them, uncanny. So they have webbed fingers, or they have scales, or anything, and it's kind of getting worse and worse. So there is clearly something wrong, and it's up to Sarah in part to figure out what role she has to play in the appearance of these monstrous conceptions. It is also a queer romance novella, which actually works quite well also with the wider themes, because the novella really questions what is monstrous, what is other to our society, what are we accepting and what aren't we? Are we forcing people to live in the shadows? And for the fact that it's a novella format, it does a lot of interesting things. It has really interesting imagery as well. The writing is really fluid. You really get the sense that you get to know Sarah, even though you don't spend a lot of time with her. And although some of the other characters around it aren't developed quite as well, I think for the fact that it's so short, it does a lot of very interesting things. And that's pretty much what I read this month. So it was definitely quite horror/paranormal focused. But that's what October is for. That's why I save these books for this month. I would love to know what you think. I've got a couple of hopefully more cheerful reads on the schedule. And this is also a warning for y'all, I've got some pretty big work things coming up in November, so we'll see how it goes with the reading, but also with the recording of the podcast, but I'll make sure to get something up for you. If you'd like to let me know what you read, do leave a comment or reach out. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.